Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Late Friday night for the fellas out on the East Coast, but I had to give you a chance to talk about your Kansas State Wildcats making a statement Friday night against Arizona. Dill, we talked about seeing this Kansas State team kind of put it to the floor and kind of find their rhythm. I think we saw Kansas State do that Friday night. I want to get into what we saw specifically from Avery Johnson, who, Dill, after watching that game and kind of comparing it to what we saw week 2 against Tulane, you can tell this kid's getting more and more comfortable at operating the quarterback position for Kansas State. You know, when to use his legs, when to sit in the pocket. You can tell there's a little bit of a different kind of juice when he throws the football versus a guy like Will Howard. I think that's what's most exciting for Kansas State fans is you already got a really good quarterback. This kid's only getting better as the season goes on. Fired up to get into it now. Before we do, and as always, to the Kansas State fans, it was, a blast talking this program in the offseason. Dill, it's no secret. You picked this Kansas State team to win the Big 12. Y'all continue to show a ton of support to the boys. Appreciate y'all. If you guys do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Much more importantly, would love to hear how you guys are feeling after the big win Friday night. Dill, I'll give you the floor here. Kansas State making a statement. How we feeling?
I mean, I think that's kind of when we think of when we were projecting what this Kansas State offense might be able to look like. This is kind of the game I think you had in mind with that ability. You have two running backs who you really like, both do a little bit of different things. DJ Giddens really can hammer the ball. I shouldn't even say that about him. I mean, he's just a good all-purpose back, can run the ball outside, obviously can run the ball inside. Then you have Dylan Edwards, who can make a lot of plays, catch the ball out of the backfield. Those guys all working together with Avery Johnson, that's kind of what you're projecting. And again, you kind of got to see the glimpse of that today, and they really kind of took it to
I think they're getting a little bit better of a feel of how they want this rushing attack to look as well. Like, this was something we were so excited for Kansas State heading into 2024. Not only do you have a super hyper dynamic athletic quarterback in Avery Johnson, you also have two phenomenal running backs. How can you get them both on the field at the same time? How can you put them in spots where they can be successful? And I thought you saw Kansas State do a really good job of that, right? When you get Dylan Edwards to the outside, like, there's just not a lot of teams in the Big 12 or quite frankly across the country that have linebackers that can deal with Dylan Edwards and the juice and speed that this kid has. And you saw Kansas State.
Not when you need to honor everything else. When you need to honor DJ Giddens, you obviously need to honor Avery Johnson again. I think they can slow teams down. I think they can keep them from just taking off when you see Dylan Edwards go somewhere. And again, he doesn't need that much grass to really take advantage and hurt teams because he is explosive in kind of the way you mentioned.
Also, another thing I would probably add with this Kansas State rushing attack, which obviously had a phenomenal game, 235 yards on the ground. Dill, this offensive line is not only when they get downhill, they can move bodies off the line of scrimmage, and you saw them kind of take control of this football game at a certain point. Really athletic dudes as well. Like, there's just not a lot of offensive lines that can run some of those outside zone concepts like Kansas State likes to run because the offensive linemen are just not athletic enough to operate in space, get to the second level. Kansas State, you can tell that they build these offensive linemen to be able to operate in that kind of run scheme, which we saw a lot under Coach Colin Klein, which I think is another worth noting is it doesn't look like this offense has really changed much. Like, you could have told me Coach Colin Klein was coaching that game, I probably would have believed you.
And you saw similar concepts, kind of the things I think you loved about what Colin Klein was doing, especially how he used the tight ends up the seam off of play action. I mean, I think they hit 3 or 4 of those plays, and those were big ones, going for touchdowns, going for first downs, being a little bit more explosive in the air. Those are big-time plays I think you didn't want to necessarily see as Colin Klein obviously took the A&M job. And I think you're right. You aren't really missing a beat. And obviously with Avery Johnson, you add a whole new dimension into this mix. So you still have similar concepts from what they were working with Colin Klein. But you obviously have a much more dynamic quarterback who I think further stresses.
I want to talk about Avery Johnson as a passer too, which I think he's super underrated as a passer. Like, look, there was a reason this kid was top 100 national recruit as a quarterback. Like, yes, he's a phenomenal athlete. We all saw that on display. Went for over 100 yards rushing. Really big-time arm talent. That being said, what I was most impressed with, again, the box score is not going to wow you, right? 14 to 23, $156, 2 touchdowns. That's not going to jump out on the screen. What does kind of jump out for me with Avery Johnson is you're seeing him kind of understand when to make certain throws. like you see him throw a lot of fireballs, and this kid has a howitzer of an arm, and he can certainly make those throws. But when they were working tight ends up the seam, or when you're working kind of layered middle of the field throws, there's some nice touch. There's a little bit of kind of layering of the football, which is something that not a ton of young quarterbacks who have the arm talent necessarily like to do. They just like to grip it and rip it. Again, you talk about the maturation of Avery Johnson. You're talking about, all right, I can rip the football to the boundary, throw it 100 miles per hour, right? Shortstop in high school, I think. That being said, I can also layer a football over some zone coverage and kind of be good with my ball placement and velocity as well. Again, I think you're seeing Avery Johnson just as a well-rounded.
There's still a fair amount of room for him, I think,
Oh,
especially
yeah.
when it comes to working the pocket. I feel like there are some times where he likes to drift back instead of stepping up, and especially when you're athletic as he is, I almost want that instinct to be work into the pocket, squirt out, and try to make some plays with your legs, or step up and throw it on the run, because he can do that really effectively. I thought he made some really nice throws on the run, given that kind of shortstop background they were obviously harping on about on the broadcast. So again, a guy who there's still kind of a fair amount of development and room to grow, I think, because there were some things that, again, the passing was better. I think that was one thing that you kind of saw for the first couple of games. You were kind of like, oh, well, this has to improve. And then against probably the best team they've played, he did dial it in. He did look really comfortable. But again, I think this passing offense yet has a lot of room to work, I think.
Yeah, and they're going to base this offense off the rushing attack, right? When you have two running backs like that and you have a guy like Avery Johnson, but you do want to be two-dimensional. That's how this Kansas State team reaches their floor. And you saw them establish the rushing attack, and then we're going to leak some tight ends out and kind of be explosive off that run game with play action. I think the last thing I'll note with Kansas State's offense, this kid's just a gamer. Like you can tell the moment outside of that snafu at the end of the half where he kind of lost track of the time a little bit, rookie mistake. The moment's not too big for this kid. And I think that's a trait that you love to see in a young quarterback. Dale, I want to be careful making this kind of a comparison, but as a fan myself, kind of the moxie like JJ McCarthy. And so I'm just going to kind of throw that out there. Like we knew JJ McCarthy was kind of a special dude when he was young. We kind of said this, the Kansas State fans who've been rocking with the boys for 12 months. Like we kind of said this last year when we saw Avery Johnson as a true freshman, not only physically special, but I think this kid is special between the ears too. Let's go over to the defensive side of the football, right? What was the key to this football game? Try to shut down T-Mac. And let's get the final box score on T-Mac. It was 11 catches for $138. So on the box score, maybe you did all you could. You talk about a special wide receiver, Dill. I think he's better than Marvin Harrison Jr. Like this kid. And this is not a knock on Kansas State's defense because I think that secondary is pretty damn good. It literally looks like a man amongst boys. I think he'd do that at just about any program in the country.
Yeah, and that was obviously, I think, a bright spot, frankly, of what Kansas State was doing today, especially coming after some brutal performances from that secondary.
Yeah, agreed.
You can't give up that many yards to teams that are inferior. And you look, this team was way too talented. You kind of look at guys like VJ Payne, Jacob Parrish, Marcus Siegel. Like these guys have played in this defense way too long or way too skilled to kind of give up some of the performances they'd given up early in the year. And they really tightened it down. Obviously, T-Mac's going to do his thing. You got to just try to put the lid on him. And it's not like he killed this game. They only scored 7 points at the end of the day.
And the plays that T-Mac made, it's like, I don't know what you – there's some of those plays where it's like, hey, you're playing good football. You just got to clap your hands and kind of appreciate greatness. That's kind of why we like this Arizona team. Like when you have a player like Noah Fafita and T-Mac, and again, what a performance by Kansas State's defense to only holding this offense to 7 points. That's going to score a lot of points over the next couple seasons, still, or I should say games. I think the brightest spot for Kansas State, and I think one of the biggest question marks we had about this defense was the pass rush.
Brendan Mott.
Brendan Mott was freaking awesome. And when you play like Kansas State, which was a lot of rush 3, drop 8, play zone coverage, because you don't want to have anybody having a responsibility to play man on T-Mac, which I loved. When you have the ability to impact the passer rushing 3 or 4, that's huge in this football game. Brendan Mott gave them that pretty much all 4 quarters.
And especially when they're going to play the way they play with that 3-man down line, that's a hard place to rush the passer from at times. I thought Brendan Mott obviously was really good. I thought Toby O had a really good game. He was one of those guys who, again, kind of got his sparing minutes last year, but was certainly a guy when you were going to lose what they were going to lose on the edge. You needed him to come up and play good football. I thought he had a really nice game. So, again, very encouraging that that defensive line played that way, especially in the pass rush. Obviously, you didn't really get a ton of sense of what they can do against the run. That's not really what Arizona's going to try to do a whole lot. And it wasn't a problem.
But they light boxed them, and I thought that was impressive. Like, able to stop the run against an Arizona team that, again, it's not their identity running the football, but I mean, Kansas State rarely played with the heavy box. They kept two safeties high pretty routinely throughout the game, and they were able to be very successful against the run.
In Austin Moore is still doing his thing. I mean, he's such a
Agreed.
guy who just has such good instincts. He makes so many tackles. He covers a lot of ground. I think, again, him, Purcell had a really nice game, I thought, for the most part. Austin Romaine had a nice game. So I think you saw what you were thinking you were going to see. I thought that linebacker core, it was going to be a really good unit. I thought they had a really nice game, obviously. But again, I think it'll be much more revelatory, if you will, when they go play teams like Utah and some of the – or in Oklahoma State, those teams that kind of have the physicality that probably matches up closer to what Kansas State's going to bring to other teams. I mean, Arizona obviously has a fair amount of skill on the perimeter and has a lot of good things, but they were always going to be a little overmatched up front by this Kansas
Love
State.
it. Late Friday night, we're making up words. Revelatory. I mean, it might be a word. I don't know. I don't have a great dictionary in the dome, but that might be a word. That being said, I think the most impressive thing I saw from Kansas State was they did it both. Like, the secondary that we had, I just was kind of floored that they were so sloppy against Tulane. That was the biggest question mark. Like, you're going to see Noah Fafita, T-Mac, and a couple of other really talented wide receivers too. Is this secondary going to rebound? It certainly didn't. The 268 yards that Noah Fafita had passing really all came on that first drive and then in the last drive in the fourth quarter. Got to give the defensive coordinator a ton of credit for making some of those post-first drive adjustments. This Kansas State team, at least in my opinion, and again, we're 3 weeks in, it answered a lot of questions, but I think what's most exciting for Kansas State fans, it's only going to get better. Like, you're a top 15 team in the country right now. You have a quarterback that, at least in my opinion, is one of the most talented quarterbacks we've seen play at Kansas State. This team sent a message Friday night. Dill, you probably feel way better about the ticket you're holding with Kansas State winning the Big 12. So shout out you. My pick's Utah. It looks like Utah and Kansas State are probably
crash course here.
Yeah, they're still the two teams to beat in the Big 12 after tonight's performance, especially with what you saw from Oklahoma State last week, just playing a sloppy game against Arkansas. They'll cut it out there. Again, appreciate you guys rocking with the boys. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Appreciate you guys, and we'll talk to y'all later.